Hello and welcome to Sizewell. Long-term campaigner, yes, and I want to talk about time. First of all, a little bit of history. Almost exactly 20 years ago, I was on the beach outside Sizewell A playing with a new toy. We just bought, saved up for 3 years since the Chernobyl disaster, we'd saved up to buy a rather expensive radiation monitor, and I was getting used to the thing, and to my surprise, I discovered that there seemed to be elevated readings as I got along the beach towards Sizewell A. Sizewell B hadn't been built at that time. When I walked up towards the fence of Sizewell A itself, the readings went up and up and up, until against the fence they were 10 times background. We didn't know what had caused that, but evidently the boffins inside Sizewell A had seen us doing it, because that very month at the liaison committee meeting they said, oh yes, but there's a radiation shine off the front of Sizewell A, don't worry about it, it's always been there, it's in the planning when we built Sizewell A, won't do any harm. You'd have to stand by the fence for a whole day to get as much as one X-ray of radiation. Well, I don't know if anyone would stand there all day. It's a bit windy in the evening, but what about the bracken and the insects and the rabbits? What happens over time? I said I'd get to talk about time. More importantly in that context is the shabbiness of the nuclear propaganda. It doesn't hold water. If they knew about it at the start of Sizewell A in the 60s, why didn't we know about what we were being exposed to? To take a step forward from that, if we have been exposed to low-level radiation ever since that time, what is the real risk to us here? Difficult to work out because half of here is sea, so there aren't any people, so it's very difficult to get any demographic information about what the cancer risks are. But even on the landward side, population is thin, and on the seaward side, of course, you've got no one. Yes. Take a step instead to Germany, where they have 16 nuclear power plants all inland, because they cool them differently from us, with either towers or in rivers, and they're in fairly dense populations. And there was a very big German study completed 2 years ago, in which it was unmistakably shown that there were elevated risks, significantly elevated risks of leukemia to children between the age of birth and 5 years old. And this was systematically repeated at all of the 16 nuclear power stations. The awkward thing about that, or the fascinating thing about that, is that the people who did that survey were of the nuclear establishment, and they could not explain it. And they said in their reports that they couldn't explain it, because it went against everything that the nuclear establishment stands for and all its received wisdom about what radiation damage will do to you. The international regulations for, or international standards for radiation show that the level of radiation coming out of those German nuclear power plants couldn't have possibly caused that cancer. And so they said, couldn't happen, couldn't be anything to do with nuclear. But all 16 nuclear power stations confirmed that. What else about time? Time and sea level rise is already making the data that British Energy at Sizewell B have about the possibility of building new nuclear power stations on this coast. 2 years ago, BE was saying, oh, that's all right, we've got our experts, and they say we can do the necessary civil engineering to protect us from sea level rise. a year ago, by which time the expected sea level rise, according to the IPCC, had doubled, they said, oh, it doesn't matter, we're still okay. 12 months ago or 6 months ago, they were not so certain, and since then, of course, the figures have been doubled again. And what they don't talk about, British Energy, is that their new planned nuclear power stations C and D here would have to store the nuclear waste, which is going to be much nastier than any nuclear waste from power stations at the moment. They'll have to store it on station for up to 160 years. Once again, the time element. Now, in 160 years' time, no one can say what's going to have happened to this coast. But we know that the Environment Agency says that in 20 years' time, they can't be sure that the Minsmere Bird Reserve is going to be still there, because sea incursion is almost certain to have happened there by now, and that's barely a mile up the coast. And where they're planning the nuclear power stations to come are lower even than Sizewell B and Sizewell A, which are on or just above the 10-metre contour line. But that's virtually an island. We're below it here. We're almost at sea level if you look at the sandbanks over there. And there's a little hump which joins the island on which the power stations are. But all round, otherwise, you've got marshland or sea or land which is going to be invaded by the sea willy-nilly within the next 160 years. Do notice that for Sizewell C and D, they're planning a new approach road, which is to come round from the north. And it's my guess that they want to put that on a causeway so they can have some protection from the sea. So if they talk about this approach road, say just how much engineering are you going to put into that to try and cut off the sea so you can protect it? But in fact, it's nonsense. They could not defend Sizewell C and D or B or A, which still has nuclear waste in it, from the sea anything like as long as 160 years.